Let's dig into the details of what lies ahead in some more detail with Chris Hattingh. He's the Executive Director at the Centre for Risk Analysis. He's joining us now live on the programme. Chris, let's start with the market reaction here. The top 40 down by over 1,300 points in today's session. The all-share down by around 1,400 points. First Rand, Standard Bank, Impala Platinum, they were all down by between 5 and 7%. What has investors really spooked about the potential of the ANC having to get into a coalition?
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity. I think the biggest question for investors, for markets, is should the ANC drop to the low 40s or even below 40%? Who remains in charge of the party? Is it current President Cyril Ramaphosa? Is there then a lot of pressure on him to step aside for someone else to take the reins? What does that mean for the party in terms of policy? Does it pursue a more centrist direction, a more left-leaning direction, maybe a more populist direction? Who does it go into coalition with, depending on who the leader is at that time of the ANC? Is there then more pressure to go into coalition with parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters or Mkhonto Sizwe, or then does the ANC go into coalition with the Democratic Alliance and parties more aligned with that party's general philosophy and ideology? So lots of uncertainty then in markets, and for investors, the lower the ANC's vote share drops, who gets what position in parliament, who gets important portfolios, cabinet positions, all that sort of thing raises questions around just predictability, stability, and the path going forward.
If let's take one of the lines of argument you've put forward there. Assuming the ANC does decide to turn on itself in the wake of this election, and they do decide to remove Cyril Ramaphosa as party leader, who else could take over, and what potential implications would that have on policy?
At the moment, the probability is quite high that the deputy president, Paul Mashatile, would take over. There's a possibility for the Secretary General, Fikile Mbalula, Gwede Mantashe, the national chairperson for the ANC, a man of great influence still within the party, would retain a lot of influence, a lot of weight. So depending on that particular choice in that direction, I think it opens up then the possibility of working either more with the Economic Freedom Fighters or with the Democratic Alliance. If it is someone like the Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, I think there's a general affinity or leaning more towards a party like the Economic Freedom Fighters. If it is some of the older guard, individuals such as Fikile Mbalula and Gwede Mantashe, I think they would more prefer working with the Democratic Alliance. Of course, overall, I don't think the ANC maybe has yet realized what the reality is on the ground, that they will have to form some sort of coalition. It's a good time to remember that in 2004, the party attained just around 69% of the national vote, and now all the way down to below 50%. So I think it's a time of serious introspection and lots of deep questions for the ANC. We know this evening the Minister of Finance was scheduled for an interview with one of South Africa's biggest business radio stations, and he asked to be excused or to postpone that interview. I think that points to serious discussions and maybe internal ruckus happening at Luthuli House as the ANC leadership tries to figure out what position should they take regarding a coalition.
Indeed, some pretty uncharted waters for the ANC. Looking at the market, though, the life and medical insurance company Discovery also closed lower, but on a year-to-date basis, they've been absolutely battered. That counters down over 20%. Is that all linked to the introduction of this national health insurance law?
I think that's a very big part of it. The National Health Insurance Bill has been in the works for many, many years, since around 2008, 2009. So it has been in the pipeline. But generally, your bigger medical aids, your entities like Discovery, many other banks and bigger corporates in South Africa, they didn't expect that the ANC would push through the NHI bill because of various constitutional concerns, public engagement process concerns, etc. So that in itself, I think, would have already sort of spooked those big medical schemes and made things quite a bit more uncertain. It's one thing to say that you've got this big policy scheme that's going to radically change public and private healthcare, but have you taken due consideration to constitutional matters, the rule of law, financing, all that kind of thing? I think creates more uncertainty for the medical industry, for healthcare in South Africa, of course, for healthcare professionals, for nurses, doctors, specialists, and also for your average South African. This is not to say that the majority of South Africans can afford to pay for private medical aid, but already for those who can afford it, it raises questions around the continued existence of medical aids. Will that sort of thing continue? And for an entity like Discovery, maybe other bigger players as well, there are questions then around the feasibility and future of those schemes.
Indeed. Modelling by the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, based on early poll outcomes, made for very interesting reading. Essentially, they're suggesting the ANC will end this election with a vote share of around 43%. But let's work with that number for the time being. What will the DA demand to get into any kind of coalition with the ANC? Because at the moment, they're the ones with the second biggest share of the vote, nearly 25%.
Look, I think a big thing for the DA, having campaigned for many years, that they are the antithesis to the ANC, that they focus on what they term good governance, service delivery, more issues around freedom of speech and fiscal responsibility, limited government. If they were to get into coalition with the ANC, how would they sell that to their voters and their base? But in terms of concessions, I think you look at your portfolio positions, perhaps Minister of Finance, you look at Minister in the presidency, you look at maybe more administrative or management positions. You could, of course, also have a confidence and supply agreement where you say you as the DA go into coalition with the ANC, you will support them when it comes to passing budgets, but you won't vote together on policy matters. So if the ANC pushes for expropriation of land or for prescribed assets and the seizing of pension funds, you then won't support them in those particular policies that you think go against your own ideology, but you still want government to function. You want to focus on the sort of management of the day, of day-to-day government business. So there could be ways to work on that in that sort of relationship. If it does happen, think of it in the sort of courting, very early dating stages where they're feeling each other out, they're seeing if it'll work together or not. I don't think it'll be a shotgun wedding, that it'll proceed to that sort of level of seriousness overnight. They'll definitely want to feel each other out over the short to medium term, and then maybe progress to more serious agreements over the long term.
Indeed, it's going to be a very interesting 2-week courting period for those two parties, eventually when they do get to that coalition talking stage. One last question for you, Chris. Hours of daily power rationing, right? That was a big meta-narrative for South Africa in 2023. We saw companies talking about it every time they're putting quarterly results out. And it was largely the same story in the first quarter of 2024. But the country's not had any kind of load shedding in the run-up to the election. And that has raised questions among South Africans. So how did Eskom A, manage to keep supply steady, but B, can that continue into June and beyond?
We think in terms of the analysis of Eskom's energy availability factor, but also the analysis of the performance of the various coal-fired power stations. Many of them are benefiting from the last few months and arguably the last 1 to 2 years of focus on maintenance and getting even the older stations, which can perform to an adequate level, just pumping out as much as possible and being as reliable as possible. Eskom has done very well to bring down the percentage of the unplanned outage factor, which last year and the year before was sitting between 30 and 40%. They've managed to bring that down quite well. Should that continue, again, a focus on daily maintenance. During winter, Eskom generally does take off more of its plant. It takes off less of its plant for maintenance to have it available to the economy. So you won't have as high levels of maintenance. So you could have more breakdowns here and there. But we think for the time being, load shedding will return in the second half of this year. That's just the trajectory and the numbers. But I think Eskom has done quite well from the maintenance point of view. That's not to say that they aren't using diesel supplies to help and supplement that. But even assuming if they burn all the diesel that they have for the open cycle gas turbines, that would only provide around 2,300 megawatts in total. That's not enough to avert serious load shedding of stages 4 and higher. So for us at the moment, very much a focus on getting the coal fleet back up. There's been announcements that 3 of those stations, the decommissioning of those, will be postponed for a couple of years. I'm speaking under correction, but 1 to 3 years. So it looks like Eskom is realizing get the most of what it can from its current fleet, still invest in other forms of energy, etc., being also afforded a lot of breathing room by private solar generation. So various mixtures and factors, I think, helping Eskom at the moment.